The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, we're going to do something a little bit different on today's show. We're going to pull back from the news of the week and pull back from some of the geopolitical issues, economic issues, climate issues that we normally cover on this show, and talk a lot about language and framing and the discourses that's happening between China and Africa and many parts of what, again, for lack of a better word, and you're going to see we're going to struggle with this word today, the Global South. And it's a word that you and I have struggled with as well. When we went to rebrand from the China-Africa Project to the China Global South Project, we went through all of the different words to describe what is this block of emerging markets, developing countries, dare I say third world countries? We'll talk about that word as well. And for lack of any other alternative, we came up with the Global South. Now, what's so interesting is that language is still a fraught language, because what is the Global South? What is the non-aligned movement? What are all these different groups? Even we've had discussions about what are the BRICS? What does it stand for? What does it mean in the context that we live in today? It's a topic that people like you, academics and scholars, spend a lot of time thinking about. And what I find interesting is that despite all of the discussions that we have about these issues, we still have not reached a consensus about how to describe this massive group of countries that have such divergent interests, but have a commonality as being former colonized countries, but not all. Have being poor countries, but not all. How do we group these different countries together in such a way that we can have a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting issue. You know, what's also very interesting is of course, the geopolitical use of this particular debate, because one finds a lot of people in places like Washington and London puzzling about what the Global South is, like very troubled by it. And of course, one of the reasons why they're so troubled about it is because China is positioned in that group. So it becomes, I think, a lot more kind of high charge, the conversation, as the geopolitics themselves become more fraught.
Well, one of the things that I find interesting is that in a lot of the discussions in the so-called Global North, and I was just in a university panel in the United Kingdom last week, and then this week there is a 2-day conference about China in the Global South put on by the Atlantic Council and the University of Notre Dame. It's all about development and influence in a shifting global order. And in both of these conferences, they started out the discussion with this angst about what to call the Global South, and that they're not comfortable with the Global South and this concept of what it is. And there's a lot of angst. And yet here in Vietnam, I've attended a number of different seminars, and they talk about South-South cooperation, and they talk about South all the time. And even Global South is often used in banners and whatnot. And it came up just last month in Uganda at the summit of the non-aligned movement that took place in Kampala. And a corollary to that, right after that non-alignment movement summit, there was the third South summit of the Group of 77 plus China. And China itself likes to use the concept of South-South cooperation. It sees itself very much as a leader of the Global South. Well, I mentioned about this Atlantic Council conference, and at the beginning of the conference, they addressed this question of language, and I think it's going to be a good setup for our discussion today with Ambassador Jorge Heine. Balari Kausukan is the chairman of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. And he was posed the question about how to define the Global South and China's relationship with it. And his remarks, I thought, were just absolutely fascinating. Cobus, let's take a listen.
What we now call the Global South, I think from political correctness, we used to call the Third World, we used to call the less developed countries, we used to call the developing countries. We used to call them we can call it the non-Western world, right? It really represents a certain mood, a mood which is partly a hangover from the colonial experience, a sense of being disadvantaged economically and politically in the global system, certain resentment at the inequalities of the system, a certain irritation with the sanctimoniousness of certain aspects of Western diplomacy, particularly European diplomacy, but also American, and a sense that Western definitions of norms are not the only definition of norms. But I think it's also important, and it takes form in organizations such as the non-aligned movement, the G77, and most recently BRICS. But this mood and these forums, I wouldn't even call them organizations, do not create any cohesion of interest, except perhaps at a very high level of generality. So high and so general that it really prescribes nothing very practical in terms of policy. The non-aligned movement, the G77, they have a certain relevance in international organizations like the UN, but I wouldn't overstate the case. Perhaps because I did some evil things in a previous life, I spent a lot of my youth as a young diplomat working in the non-aligned movement and in the G77. I can tell you there is very little cohesion in them. It represents a mood. Now that mood should be taken seriously. And China, if insofar as it has any success in cultivating, we'll call it the global south for convenience, is because it takes that mood, or it pretends to take that mood seriously. And if its successes are perhaps even more so the result of the West, Europe, North America not taking that mood seriously enough. But I think one of the reasons China is making a concerted effort, not new, but a renewed effort to cultivate the global south, is really because its policies towards the developed countries, the global north, if you like, towards North America, towards Europe, towards Japan, have been failures. I can't think of any country in the so-called global north, and in fact, many countries in the global south that are not without concerns about anxieties about one aspect or another of Chinese behavior. They also have concerns about Western behavior, one aspect or the other. But I think it's important to understand that these generalities like global south, third world, developing world, conceal a multiplicity of interests. And that multiplicity is much more important or as important as the mood. It doesn't mean that these countries, however resentful they may be about different aspects of Western policy, are going to drink deeply of Chinese Kool-Aid. They have their own interests, they have their own agencies. Some of those interests, maybe even many of those interests, were aligned with China's interests, but not all of them. Some were aligned with Western interests, and some were not aligned with either Chinese or Western interests. And that is certainly very clear in my part of the world, Southeast Asia. But I think it's clear, generally speaking, in this amorphous animal we call the Global South.
Once again, that was Bilari Kasukan, who's chairman of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore, making the case for the complexity of the definition of the Global South. Cobus, let's get your reaction.
Definitely, there's a lot to unpack there. I think this kind of, analysis of it, I think, is really interesting. For me, when people complain that the Global South, they're not all in the South, in the Southern Hemisphere, or they complain that they're all not necessarily like former colonies, or in this case, also there's this kind of the raising the issue that they have many different interests and they don't have a shared agenda. For me, all of those views seem to miss the really strong, I think, utility of the concept of the Global South, which is that it provides a sense of a shared reality. Like a reality to my mind, and this is one that I frequently mention in relation to this, is that it shares a shared experience of systemic underdevelopment. But I think it also increasingly shares there's a certain set of options that are open and not open to the world, right? So let me give you an example. A little while ago, I spent some time in Cape Town. Obviously, I am South African, so I went to Cape Town, very beautiful city, and a city with a very strong tourist economy. And it is very interesting to be in co-working spaces and you just hear German, Danish, and Dutch around you, like all the time. To the extent where there's even signage in some shops in Cape Town, like, wir sprechen Deutsch, So Germans can come to South Africa, they can buy property in South Africa, they can spend months and months in South Africa working in these co-working spaces, and no one complains about that, right? Like, everyone's very happy to have euros moving into the economy. They have powerful passports. When I go to Germany, and I did spend some time in Germany last year, then I have to go through a very onerous multi-week visa process. Many of the people of my cohorts from other parts of Africa have many stories about not getting the visa despite spending lots of money on it, booking a flight ticket that's not refundable. And they have to just kind of hope and pray that they get that visa. And then once they get there, like, the border guards in Germany will personally remind you that you're only there for 4 days. Remember, only 4 days. And that is even in the case, of people like me who end up doing research that then feeds directly into German stores of knowledge, into the work of the German state. That's the difference. There's the difference. Those two lived experiences, that's why the Global South is a valuable concept.
That's that privilege, right? I mean, in this case, it's the passport privilege.
It's not only passport privilege, it's access to financing, it's control of international organizations. It's the right to whether you are real in the world or not, whether you actually exist in the world or not. So, like, a large part of the world's population are essentially shadow populations, right? They don't have this kind of right to cross borders, they don't have the right to count as people. And that is where it lies, I think.
And in many ways, that sense that you're talking about, and also that Kausikan also addressed, is this mood. And that mood is fueling what a lot of people are calling the active non-alignment movement. This was very much a topic of conversation in Kampala, as we talked about. It's also the focus of a book that came out last year by Ambassador Jorge Heine, who is a research professor at the Frederick S. Party School of Global Studies at Boston University. And he's also the former Chilean ambassador to China, India, and South Africa. Now, the book that he wrote, Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option, that was co-edited with Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami, that just came out in paperback. And so we thought this would be a really good time to circle back to Ambassador Heine to talk to him about these questions of the non-aligned movement, the Global South, these terms. What you're going to hear is a very passionate defense of these ideas of the Global South. So while people at the Atlantic Council and at various universities are squeamish about it, nervous about it, there's anxiety in what to call this. Not with Ambassador Heine. He is right down the line. Cobus, though, when we spoke with the ambassador, there was a little bit of background noise in his apartment. And so we want to apologize that at parts of the conversation, you may hear some clinking and clanking. And we thought, should we go ahead with the interview or should we postpone it? And you were very determined. You said these ideas are important to get out there. And even with that background noise that you're going to hear, so we hope it's not going to be too distracting, but you were adamant, we've got to get this show out.
I think these are important discussions, and I think they're important emerging trends. And particularly how China fits into these issues is a very, very important trend. And it's a trend that I think is going to determine a lot of international relations, over the next few decades, particularly as I think the traditional global north countries, the US, its European allies, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, are increasingly kind of drawing up the drawbridge. So they're very, very anxious even now about free trade. They're very anxious about migration. They're increasingly isolating themselves from the world, but they are also adamant to keep control of the world, So that in that sense, I think the kind of complexities and the very kind of fundamental contradictions that come from China's positioning in all of this, I think really deserves some unpacking.
Okay, well, let's take a listen now to our discussion with Ambassador Jorge Heine about the active non-alignment option. Ambassador Jorge Heine, welcome back to the show. It's wonderful to have you on the program, and congratulations on the publication of the paperback edition of the book.
Thank you very much.
The book is called Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. I just want to give credit also to your co-editors, Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami. The timing of the book now is so interesting simply because just last month we had the summit of the non-aligned movement that took place in Kampala, Uganda. For those of you who didn't follow it, leaders from 120 countries participated in this event, making it the second largest group of countries after the United Nations. The non-aligned movement was founded in 1961 at the height of the Cold War. And while it fell out of fashion for many years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's clearly a desire to revive the movement in the current era of great power competition, and that's what you're advocating for. Tell us now, it's been a year or two since you launched the book, and the hardcover version of it. How is it holding up in the current era, in this post-Gaza era too?
It is holding up very well, and I will say this. The initial edition of the book, as you may recall, was published in Spanish in November of 2021. It's an edited volume that we put together with my colleagues Carlos Fortin and Carlos Uminami. It has chapters by 5 former foreign ministers of leading Latin American countries and 1 serving foreign minister. So it is, very representative of current views and perspectives on the international scene by leading Latin Americans. And what is fascinating, it seems to me, is that this was, as I said, the book was launched in November of 2021. We had launched it in 5-6 different countries. And then in February of 22, Russia invaded Ukraine. And at that moment, it became apparent that many countries in the global south were not siding with the Western position, not so much in many cases in not condemning the invasion, which many did, is a violation of international law and of the United Nations Charter. But what they strongly disagreed on was on the unilateral Western sanctions on Russia, which the overwhelming majority of countries in the global south, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America reject. And that brought to the fore the notion of non-alignment. We take a page from the non-aligned movement that you referenced earlier. But we adapted to the realities of the new century, and that is why we call it active non-aligned. And the other thing that I found fascinating then, the hardback edition of the book was published by Ansem in London in February of 2023. And 2023 has been, according to many observers, the year in which the global south has really come into its own. We had, of course, the situation of the BRICS expansion in Johannesburg for the first time since South Africa joined in 2010. We had 6 countries invited to join the BRICS, which obviously made a very significant difference to the group. Then we had the G20 summit in New Delhi. I was in New Delhi shortly before that summit, and a lot of people were very skeptical. They thought it's not going to work. President Putin, of course, has said he wasn't going to go. President Xi didn't go either. At some point, it was touch and go whether President Biden would go. There were questions about the fact whether there would be a final declaration, a final statement, given the difference over the war in Ukraine. But in the end, it turned out very well. It was considered a great success. The African Union, as you know very well, of course, was invited to join as a full member. There was a final statement. Differences were papered over. And the G20 summit in Delhi was considered really a feather in India's diplomatic cap. Then later on that month, we had in Havana the meeting of the G77 plus China, which preceded the one you mentioned in Kampala a few weeks ago. And then, of course, we had Gaza, which has again brought to the fore the huge difference that exists between North and South. So all in all, I would say that the sort of ascent of the global South has gone hand in hand with the notion of active non-alignment. And it seems to me that goes to show how timely this notion was that emerged originally in Latin America as a way to deal with the tensions between China and the United States, in which Latin America was caught, between a rock and a hard place, as it were, during the pandemic, at a time of severe economic crisis. And this was what we considered to be the best way out. And then it has expanded to Africa and to Asia. So I must say we feel quite vindicated.
You mentioned the rise of the Global South, and 2023 was interesting for me in terms of how much opposition there was from many kind of Global North commentators, different kind of journalists and, kind of analysts and so on, like how much kind of criticism there was of the concept of the Global South and general kind of discomfort kind of expressed around the concept of the Global South. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like how you see that concept and how the concept of the Global South overlaps or aligns with the concept of non-alignment or active non-alignment then.
Well, I see them, moving forward hand in hand. And you're quite right to point out this pushback that we have seen. Researchers at leading think tanks like Chatham House in London, like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and also elsewhere, have come out in writing against the very use of the notion of Global South, saying that the term should be retired because it is dangerous and divisive. Now, if you say a term should be retired, what we're really implying is that the reality that that term describes does not exist. That is what you're really saying. And the argument here is it's just a bunch of countries. The term is imprecise. So, it's just a bunch of countries. It's very dangerous to ascribe to them certain common characteristics because that is divisive. I find that is intellectually untenable. I mean, how can you say something like that? Moreover, I teach a course on North-South relations here at Boston University. There's an extensive literature using the term. So suddenly to say, we don't like it because it's dangerous, because it pits the West against the rest of the world. Well, these are the realities we are dealing with. How can you be so arrogant and say, let us retire this term because we find it inconvenient for geopolitical reasons? So I find it quite extraordinary. Now, what is remarkable is that those expressions came out, as far as I can monitor them, basically in July, August of last year. That is, this was before Gaza. And what Gaza has done, the war in Gaza, it has brought to the fore the fact that this very stark cleavage between North and South is much bigger than we had realized. If you look at, votes in the United Nations General Assembly, you will realize that the United States and Israel are pretty much isolated. And you had votes, 140, 150 countries voting for a ceasefire, underlining the fact that what we have been arguing for some time, that the notion that the key cleavage in today's world would be between democracy and authoritarianism, as some would have it, is quite wrong-headed. It's not that way. The real cleavage is between North and South. And that is what has come to the fore, it seems to me, after Gaza.
I'm so glad you brought this up because this is a topic of discussion that we have quite a bit. Obviously, the phrase Global South is in our brand, the China Global South Project. And I'll tell you, when we went through our process of trying to come up with a name, it was the worst best alternative or the best worst alternative that we could find. And one of the reasons why we decided to go with the name is because we hear that people in the Global South themselves are using this. At the non-alignment movement, there was a lot of reference to South-South cooperation. There was a very liberal use of the word Global South. It seems to me in the discussions that I had, and I just had this discussion at a closed-door UK university event last night, and somebody expressed saying the word Global South is poor framing. And the only people that I hear object to this framing are people in the UK, the US, and in the Global North. So when we ask them, what is the alternative? Okay, if it's not that, they don't like the word emerging markets. That's weird. They don't like developing countries. There's limitations to that. And I say, okay, what is the alternative if it's not the word Global South to describe the G77 plus, for example, or the non-aligned movement? How do you describe these countries? And I guess I'd love to hear your take on, again, what they say, but what are the alternatives and what are people in countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia saying, and how do they describe themselves?
It's important here to put things in perspective. Obviously, the traditional term to describe these countries, the one that was used in the 20th century, was third world. There's a whole history behind that term, and that is what the non-aligned movement was originally associated with. Now, what happened, as we know, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the disappearance of the Soviet Union, there was no second world. So how can you have a third world without a second world? And it is at that point that the term Global South, originally in the 60s, came to the fore. And it seems to me the third world ended up having certain negative connotations, in terms of poverty, in terms of destitution, and so on. The Global South has a more neutral connotation. I also talk about the New South, by which I refer to countries like China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico. These are the emerging powers, rising powers that are making such a difference in world affairs. So, bottom line, it seems to me the term Global South describes well these realities. It is here to stay, and no amount of calls from the Global North to retire it will succeed.
So, as you mentioned, we're seeing a kind of emerging landscape of Global South or non-aligned kind of institutions or groupings. So you mentioned the non-aligned movement. We also mentioned the G77. And I guess I think many people would also characterize the BRICS as an example of that. How do these kind of groupings differ? Like, for example, how is the G77 and the non-aligned movement, how are they different?
Well, the G77 is basically the sort of United Nations expression of the non-aligned movement. That was its origin, at the time when it was established. But let me underline the following. Our argument for active non-alignment is not so much a call for a movement. It is a call for a doctrine. It is a call for a certain approach to the management of foreign policy and of international relations in the current international situation. And that, it seems to me, is very important. It is basically a guide to action at a very difficult moment in world affairs, in which wars have increased, in which tensions between the United States and China, the United States and Russia have reached, very dangerous limits. And in that situation, countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America find themselves under a lot of pressure from the great powers. So the question is, what is the way forward? What do you do? And what we are saying is that active non-alignment provides a guide, a compass, as it were, on how to navigate these very troubled and stormy waters.
Help me understand something, and I've had a couple conversations with people about this issue, about active non-alignment, from countries that have taken very strong positions against the United States on Israel, for example, or have taken strong positions on the war in Ukraine, and in many ways do not seem to be non-aligned. They seem to be very partisan, in fact, of their critique of the U.S. in particular, but sometimes it's against China, but for the most part it's against the U.S. And Cobus and I were talking about this too, about how can a country be consistently opposed to the U.S. and still maintain credibility as a non-aligned country?
Well, that's another thing we like to underline. In our view, one of the banes of the non-aligned movement in the 70s and 80s is that it ended up tilting towards the Soviet Union. This is what happened, for example, when Cuba decided to endorse the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and in doing so, destroyed much of its credibility as a leading member of the non-aligned movement. So, bottom line, it seems to us at the essence of active non-alignment lies the fact that you have to actually be non-aligned. This is not a question of being pro-China or pro-Russia and against the United States. That would defeat the whole exercise. And so let me give you an example, and let's go beyond Latin America for a moment. A country like Vietnam, which you know well, receives President Biden and declares it to be a strategic partner. At the same time, Vietnam receives President Xi, has excellent relations with China, and also has very good relations with Russia, which has been a traditional provider of defense equipment to Vietnam. So Vietnam sees no conflict in doing all those things at the same time. It's called bamboo diplomacy. That is the sort of thing we are seeing more and more. We see it in Indonesia. Brazil, of course, is an excellent example of that. President Lula, after taking office, he visited Washington before going to Beijing. And he gets along very well, as an excellent working relationship with President Biden, which does not mean he doesn't work also very well with President Xi. Trade between Brazil and China last year reached $158 billion with surplus for Brazil. So, for Brazil, both the relations with Washington and with Beijing are very important. And there is no tilting there. The whole idea of active non-alignment is you keep yourself, in a very balanced position between the great powers.
Cobus, let me put that question to you as well, because you had a very interesting yet different take on that dilemma. The idea that, a country can criticize the United States and criticize Gaza, but still, and criticize the U.S. policy on Gaza and criticize Israel, but yet still remained very much non-aligned.
With the way that I saw it was that non-alignment, Ambassador, please correct me, that non-alignment particularly makes sense in a context of, some form of Cold War context, where the issue, as was during the original Cold War and, that's emerging at the moment, where, alignment particularly, means choosing sides between superpowers or between powerful states. One could refuse to do that, in the way that a country like Indonesia has historically done, while still criticizing, kind of governance lapses or human rights lapses or, kind of other problems in the world. For example, the way that Indonesia has historically pursued codes of conduct for the South China Sea. So non-alignment doesn't necessarily mean that one isn't taking a position on world issues. It simply means that one isn't taking a position in relation to specific kind of power blocks. Ambassador, did I kind of get that relatively correctly?
You're right. Active non-alignment does not mean neutrality. It does not mean equidistance, that all the time you have to stand somewhere in the middle between the positions of the great powers. On the contrary, active non-alignment means a flexible position in which on certain issues, countries can be closer to the United States. In the case of Latin America, for example, on issues like democracy and human rights, obviously we will be closer to the United States. On the other hand, on issues like, say, a global trade or, technology transfer, we might be closer to China. So active alignment does not mean that you stand sort of rigidly in the middle. It gives you sufficient flexibility to pick and choose. Now, what it does mean is what you do not do is to stand systematically with one or another of the great powers. That, of course, ceases to be non-alignment. It becomes alignment. There are some countries that do that, but it is not active non-alignment.
You teach in the United States. You interact and interface a lot with U.S. stakeholders, government, civil society, and what. Do you get the sense that Americans understand the nuances of what you're saying? Or because I tend to think that we have, as a people, more binary views of the world. You're with us or you're against us. When you're trying to split it here and saying, well, it's more complicated than that. So what's the reaction when you talk about this with your students and with stakeholders?
Sure. Obviously, for a long time in the United States, there has been a strong distrust of the very notion of non-alignment. John Foster Dulles famously said that non-alignment is immoral. So there are some, you're quite right, there are some remnants of that right now. But I will also say, I am very encouraged by colleagues in this great country that are realizing that the United States must understand that there is something called the Global South. That the countries in the Global South have positions that differ on a number of issues from traditional U.S. policy. And that Washington would do much better if it would understand that and would try to accommodate those positions than simply deny their existence and call for, retire the very use of the term. So, there's the Quincy Institute in Washington, D.C. is one such research group that has been advocating such position, and there are others. So I see movement. People are realizing that the world is changing and that unless Washington takes cognizance of that, things will get a lot worse before they get better.
Have you had a chance to have these conversations with people from the MAGA side of the political spectrum, from the Trump wing of, I mean, that represents about a half of the American body politic, so it's not insignificant.
Well, no, there is a strong isolationist current in U.S. politics right now that obviously is very much against these developments. I'm talking about, positions within the current government, between, in the Democratic administration, in various think tanks and so on. I am not talking so much about the MAGA movement.
So far we've approached non-alignment and active non-alignment from the position of the agency of developing countries, or kind of global South countries, and their navigation of the world system. When one kind of flips it upside down and one starts to look at how superpowers approaching non-aligned movements, one of the things that really struck me at the G77 plus China summit in Kampala a few weeks ago was I made my way through the final communique that was released from that summit, or from that gathering. And it was notable for me that a lot of Chinese talking points had been integrated as priorities, and also Chinese language. So, for example, a community of shared destiny. For example, those kind of like coded terms that one finds very frequently in Chinese government discourse have also found a place within the official communique from the G77 plus China meeting. So how do you look at non-alignment from this opposite side when one looks at how, for particularly China, in the aftermath of October 7th, China's has been doing a lot of work, position itself symbolically as standing with the global South, and to a certain extent sometimes speaking for the global South, for example in the UN Security Council around Gaza. So I was wondering kind of how you look at it when you turn it upside down in that way.
Yes, that's a great question. And I will say this, I've heard that question before, and some people say, well, this doesn't look to me like non-alignment. It looks like the global South is siding with China. And, this sort of goes against the grain of what non-alignment is all about. Well, I would look at it differently. What we are seeing, and that it seems to me is one of the things that Chinese foreign policy has shown to be particularly nimble on. It is not that the global South is siding with China. It's that China is siding with the global South. And that is a different proposition. If you look at the resolutions in the final statement from Kampala, you will see that a lot of the concerns that are primary concerns in food insecurity, issues related to climate change, sustainable development, and so on. These are, very legitimate concerns from countries in the global South. Now, if China embraces them and China supports them, so much the better. It makes it, more possible for them to be finally enacted. So it seems to me it is a very different thing to say the global South is supporting China. No, China is supporting the goals of the global South. And that is very different.
You mentioned the BRICS earlier on. I think a lot of people are struggling to understand, what is this thing, the BRICS? There's now 10 countries in it. Argentina decided to pass on it with new President Milei said it's not for him. It's not the right time right now. So of the 6 members that were invited, 5 decided to join. It's a very large presence of African countries. So I guess the question is what to make of it. They had their first meeting this year of the new enlarged group that includes Iran, Russia, and China. That's a grouping of countries that many people in Europe and the United States would see as hostile. The BRICS doesn't seem like it's really accomplished very much over the past 8-9 years that it's been in existence. Generally speaking, when multilateral groups get bigger, they don't become more effective. It's more difficult to get things done. What are we supposed to make of the BRICS today in 2024?
Well, let me say the following. Having been ambassador to 3 of the original 5 BRICS countries, South Africa, India, and China, this is a subject that I follow closely. It is a subject very close to my heart. So, I will say this, and I would strongly disagree with your statement that the BRICS has not accomplished very much.
Okay.
Let me say the following. When the BRICS had its first summit in 2009, and for a number of years, the standard Western commentary was twofold. On the one hand, it said it's just a talk show. It doesn't mean anything. They just meet together and come out with these highfalutin statements. Who cares? And the second statement says, they have no right to be together. Russia is not a rising power. It is a declining power. It shouldn't even be in that group. Well, That shows a total misunderstanding of how foreign policy works. It's up to countries themselves to decide with whom they associate. It's not for others, to tell them what they should do. What should Russia do? Associate itself with other declining powers? With Albania? I mean, what kind of argument is that?
No, that's a ridiculous argument. But in terms of the accomplishments, besides the new development bank, what have they done?
No, hold on. Well, hold on. So then they said they were going to come up with a bank. And the West erupted in laughter. They will never do it. Nobody's going to put up any money. And if they do, it's not going to work. It's going to be a politicized bank that would soon lose all credibility. Well, I was in Beijing when the bank was established, headquartered in Shanghai, $50 billion. First Indian CEO. It's now run by none other than former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. Now, let me ask you the following. With Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates joining the BRICS, can you imagine the sort of foreign currency reserves they could contribute to the new development bank? I mean, the potential is extraordinary.
But again, that's aspirational. Of course, the potential is enormous. But what have they accomplished in the 8 years that they've actually been in existence?
I mean, it's not for me to say. After its first 5 years, The Economist, which, is not exactly a great champion of the Global South, had a very positive review of the role that the new development bank had played with its loans, in member countries and elsewhere, and how they were moving forward. Credit rating agencies have given it very good reviews as well. So, I mean, it's not for me to say.
No dispute that the new development bank is a tremendous accomplishment. However, in 8 years of existence, if that's all we have, that's not a lot here in that respect. And so I don't mean to sound negative. I'm just really trying to understand what are the accomplishments of the BRICS and what should we expect going forward in practical terms.
Absolutely. Well, let me say the following. It seems to me that in many ways, the BRICS embodies and represents what the New South that I referred to earlier is all about. There is a difference there, between the non-aligned movement in all its unwieldiness, 120 plus countries. As you said, big groups, find it difficult to get anything done. Well, the BRICS is much smaller and embodies this New South. I mean, China is the biggest economy in the world today, as measured in PPP terms. India's will be the fastest growing economy in the world, largest economy, I think 6.5%. By 2050, 7 of the top 10 economies in the world will be non-Western ones. I mean, the BRICS embody that movement. And it's not just a bank. It's also what they represent and, the direction they are moving. So, I would strongly disagree with the notion that they haven't accomplished much. I think they have.
Another kind of really notable moment, I think, since the publication of the book has been all of the different complications around the crisis in Gaza. I was wondering, from your position of looking at active non-alignment and the kind of positioning of the Global South, what kind of impact do you think the Gaza crisis has had on these issues?
Well, I think it has had an enormous impact. And let me tell you why. What we had since the end of World War II and, the emergence of what is known as the liberal international order, we had a certain narrative about what the West and Western countries stood for. And at the core of that narrative was very much the notion of human rights and universal human rights. And that the West stood for the defense of those rights. And, you could argue that it was a bit hypocritical. Many dictators across Africa, Asia, and Latin America were supported by the West because they were anti-communist. And in those cases, their human rights violations didn't matter very much. But still, somehow that tenet stood. Now, this gained a special currency, renewed currency, with the fall of the Berlin Wall and of the socialist camp in Central Europe when the unipolar moment came about. But I would argue very strongly that what Gaza has revealed, that in the West, there is no such thing as a commitment to universal human rights. And the contrast there between what is happening in Gaza and how the West is reacting to the killing of, I think it's by now 28,000 people, the largest number of women and children killed in any war in the past 2 years, in all wars in the past 2 years. The contrast between that and what we are seeing in Ukraine is extraordinary. Now, why the difference? Why so many complaints in taking Russia to the International Criminal Court and so on because of Ukraine, and nothing of the sort in the case of Gaza? Well, it's very simple. Ukrainians are Europeans. Palestinians are not. So what Gaza has shown is that this pretense that the West stands for universal human rights is very hollow. It only stands for them when it is about Europeans or when it is about weaponizing human rights against adversaries. Otherwise, it doesn't mean much. And that, it seems to me, makes a huge difference. Gaza has revealed that the emperor has no clothes.
Ooh, there's a lot to unpack on that one. So what about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? Because in the US and in Europe, they would say, well, they're not Western. But in that case, I think you would probably argue that they're weaponizing this against China. Is that correct?
Of course, absolutely. No, I am not saying there are no real human rights violations being committed in Xinjiang. I'm not saying that.
No. But it's about the way that the West frames it. Cobus, let me ask this question for you, just to pick up on what Ambassador Heine said here. So the South Africans go to the ICJ in defense of Gaza, but don't go to the ICJ about Russia or Xinjiang or the Rohingya or anywhere else. Why are the South Africans singling out this particular issue if they're trying to channel the spirit of Mandela, and a violation of rights anywhere is a violation of rights everywhere?
So in theory, South Africa had a human rights-based foreign policy kind of from the end of apartheid to now, and that is frequently called a kind of a Mandela-style human rights foreign policy. In practice, that has to a large extent fallen away. But the reason why I think the South Africans are in a unique position to particularly deal with the Israel issue, while it's not in a particularly kind of well-placed position to deal with all of the other examples of human rights abuses that you mentioned, was because South Africa and Israel have a very entwined history. Apartheid South Africa and Israel, as we know it, today, both emerged right after the Second World War. They both actually came into being in 1948. And since then, they've been working very closely together. So apartheid South Africa and the Israeli government were allies. And it came out during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that the apartheid secret police had received training from the Mossad. And on the other side, the Palestinian forces and the African National Congress and other anti-apartheid movements in South Africa were also actively aligned with each other, and they were specifically working together beyond the kind of general kind of South-South solidarity of that era. They were kind of working together quite close. And, the fact that there is, for example, a huge statue of Nelson Mandela in Ramallah, for example, is, kind of shows that kind of shared history. So on both the apartheid kind of Israel side and the anti-apartheid Palestinian side, these histories have continued uninterrupted. So in that sense, South Africa feels itself to have a particular kind of historical responsibility. The other issue is that what has come to be, and that I know is really criticized within the US and very criticized in Israel, but has come to be seen around the world as one way of talking about Israel, which is that it is a kind of a form of settler colonialism and an apartheid state. Of course, those two concepts, South Africa is not the only settler colonial country, but but those two concepts are very, very much salient in the case of South Africa. Like South Africa is not only the textbook example, obviously, of apartheid, but also of settler colonialism, but particularly in the relation of those things in their relation to Western power and the way that both countries have functioned as kind of frontier states, like being where the bodies of the settlers, or in the case of the Afrikaners and the kind of like Anglo, kind of white settlers in South Africa, they formed a kind of a buffer, kind of for like that represented the furthest edge of Western empire and made life easier for Western empire in those particular regions. And I know a lot of people will take issue with that characterization of Israel, but one has seen that characterization of Israel even coming from Israeli allies in the US, for example. So I think those kind of shared overlaps means that the South Africans in the historical context felt a particular specific kind of, duty to intervene on the Israel issue, whereas the other crises that you mentioned felt a lot further away for them. But that's obviously only part of the story.
Well, my point is the following. that in the case of Gaza, you just look at the numbers and civilian casualties, women and children, it puts it in a totally different category of other wars. I mean, there are 50 wars going on in the world right now. So, there's a limit to what you can do. And I will say this, from a Latin American perspective, the leadership role that South Africa has taken by taking this case to the ICJ, has generated tremendous admiration. They see this as actually harking back to Nelson Mandela's legacy and standing up for the values that we all see the new South Africa embodies. So I would say that this has been one of the best moments of South African foreign policy, since I left South Africa in the 1990s. And I am very impressed by the role that South Africa has taken in that regard.
Well, let's wrap up our discussion trying to put your book in the context of what's going on today. The book is entitled Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. If people are interested in these issues beyond Latin America, is the book relevant?
It is. Why is it relevant? Because the book arose out of the context of a particular dilemma faced by Latin American countries, which was that it saw itself pressured, both by Washington and Beijing, to take up certain positions at a very difficult moment during the pandemic, at a time of economic crisis. And we suggested that the way out was an active non-alignment position. What we have seen since the publication of the original Spanish edition is that the world, not just in Latin America, but also in Asia and in Africa, has realized that, there is a revival of non-alignment now in a new incarnation. We call it active non-alignment. Other countries may use other terms. But we are seeing it in the positions taken, like, say, India on the war in Ukraine, Pakistan, Indonesia, Brazil, Mexico, and so on. So it is gaining much traction, across the global south. I've been in seminars in South Africa, in India, in Brazil, and I've seen how this is really, making tremendous headway.
The book is Latin American Foreign Policies in the New World Order, the Active Non-Alignment Option. The paperback version is now available. It is considerably more affordable, and that makes it more accessible. Just $35 at Amazon. Highly recommended. I've had the privilege of reading it, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it. It's edited also by Carlos Fortin and Carlos Ominami, in addition to Ambassador Heine. Ambassador Heine is a research professor at the Frederick S. Party School of Global Studies at Boston University, and also, as he mentioned, the former Chilean ambassador to China, India, and South Africa. So thank you so much. It's always just such an exciting pleasure to have you on the show. You really get the blood flowing with all these ideas, which is wonderful. And so we really appreciate it. And again, recommend to everybody to go out and buy the book. Ambassador Heine, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Have a great evening.
Cobus, thank goodness we have a transcript of this show, because I almost feel like we could get the best Atlantic article out of this transcript, because there is so much ground we covered, and he is so forceful in his views on this. And again, I just find it very unusual that in the United States that these views get a hearing. Now, maybe in Democrat Washington they get a hearing, but in Republican Washington, I don't think they get a lot of, and he even said that this is not MAGA territory that he's into. That being said, it's important that people in the global north hear what he's saying, because there's not a very solid understanding of these issues, of that reference of the global south as a concept, even the language used for it, this concept of non-alignment, and these very, very provocative yet subtle yet nuanced views on issues like Gaza. So poorly understood, and poorly understood from the concept and from the perspective of developing countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America. Clearly, people have their own narratives, but in terms of understanding how do Brazilians, Argentinians, Vietnamese, South Africans look at these issues, there's a huge valley there, and he is very, very forceful in trying to close that, or at least trying to articulate a strong perspective from the point of view of the non-aligned movement.
Absolutely. And I think also his perspective as coming from a big global south country and having been an ambassador in several other very important global south countries just shows that I think there's a kind of a default assumption in the global north and to a certain extent, I think even in China, that the global south is largely an idea taker. Kind of that ideas are generated in the global north and the global south kind of aligns themselves along certain ideas coming from elsewhere. What I think his work really shows is how much the global south is emerging as a thought leader about how the world should run. Frequently an ignored thought leader, that is, but at the same time, there's a very strong set of ideas coming out of a kind of a South-South cosmopolitanism, like a kind of the worlds where people from the Middle East, from India, from China, from Africa are kind of mixing in these kind of meeting rooms over and over. That is providing a kind of an environment of global thought leadership increasingly that frequently doesn't really penetrate into the global north because the global north is in a kind of an echo chamber. It's because they have very, very strong media, and that media is really tailored to their needs, and it really speaks to them on a daily basis. And in that kind of clamor, it's hard for these other ideas to make it into that ecosystem, particularly if they weren't originally kind of published in English. I mean, of course, Ambassador Heine's book was originally published in English, but no, it was actually Spanish, right, originally. But anyway, those conversations don't kind of travel, over that wall frequently, and so I think there isn't necessarily as much of an awareness of this issue, for example, of, that he was highlighting that China is aligning itself with the global south, intellectually in some ways, rather than the other way around.
So following the thread of what you're saying, is China a global north or global south country in your view?
So, okay, I have a particular kind of view on this, and I'm busy kind of working my way through this debate. So this view might shift, but like the way I see it now is that China is a global south country. In many ways, China is, in some aspects, China is a key global south country, right? Kind of like there's many parts of China that have developmental issues very similar to parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, and so on. Obviously, Eastern China, the Eastern Chinese seaboard is a massive economy. And collectively, China is also obviously the world's second largest economy, or largest economy, depending on how you count it. That doesn't change the fact that its GDP per capita, for example, or along some of these very standard metrics, China isn't per person necessarily as rich as it is collectively as a country. So that's a kind of long-winded way of saying that what I think China is it's both a global south country and a superpower. And that is an emerging type. I think that is what we're seeing. That is what power looks like in the 21st century. It's like a lot. It's not only China. It's also Indonesia. It's even parts of the Middle East. It's Brazil. It's India. Par excellence. All of these countries are all upcoming superpowers or global powers, and yet actual global south country. And part of that is because I think it's become basically impossible for countries to become a developed country, the kind of classic 20th century style developed country. I think that class of countries is essentially a relic of the past. And they're not really enlarging their numbers, right? South Korea was maybe the last one, really, that made that transition from being, for example, an aid recipient to an aid donor. That basic flip. There may be a few other countries that managed to make it through, but very, very few. Almost everyone, all of the global south countries are permanently structurally stuck in the global south. To a certain extent, I think that's also true for China. One of the people that we interviewed a lot, or several times in the past, Lauren Johnston, has made the point that China is kind of missing the demographic boat to a certain extent. That their population is aging before they've managed to really kind of have broad-based prosperity to the level that Japan achieved before their population, started aging so rapidly. So in that sense, I think China is the face of new power. It's a global south superpower, and that kind of positions it structurally, politically, against the OG legacy superpower that is the US, that represents first worldism in all its complexity.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of countries, even Vietnam, where I am, are stuck in the middle income trap and may never actually get through it. Interestingly, Vietnam is starting to face many of the same problems that China is facing in terms of an aging demographic, and that it's going to get old before it gets rich. That is the saying in China, and that's affecting quite a few countries as well. Very quickly about the BRICS, I really found everything that he said throughout the program very engaging, but I didn't leave the BRICS discussion satisfied. When pressed on what the accomplishments are, we came up with the bank, and that's it. And that's important. Don't get me wrong. I really believe the new development bank is a major accomplishment. But for all of the hope, aspirations, and hype around the BRICS, it doesn't feel like there's much else that is there other than a place to... I know that Ambassador Heine is not going to agree with what I have to say here, but it's a forum for grievance. Grievance against the West, grievance against the international system, grievance against the dollar, all of these things. And I believe grievance-based politics are very important today. Don't get me wrong. That is not insignificant. And if that's all that the BRICS does, that by itself is something important to channel all of that grievance. But in terms of tangible accomplishments, still don't know what they've done.
I agree with you. I do think, however, that in the kind of time scale we're talking about, only having set up a notable new kind of multilateral development bank over its time, that is already quite an accomplishment considering how slow these processes are. I think the achievement thing needs to be balanced, or like measuring achievement in addition, like beyond the issue of the new development bank itself. BRICS, the discussion around BRICS achievement has to be put into the context of the fact that BRICS also didn't particularly agree on a set of organizing principles or a set of shared positions before making that block. So it's a kind of a unique block in that sense, that they're kind of all over the world. They don't necessarily have that much in common in specific kind of political positions, but they didn't only set up a bank, they also set up a set of related and other institutions. So, kind of there are, different kind of like BRICS coordinating mechanisms and in media sharing and, a lot of these institutions have been set up. And none of them may do anything particularly notable, but the setting up of an entire set of alternative institutions to the ones that we know as multilateral ones and that tend to be centered around Western power, that itself is notable. So you characterize it as a shared grievance. Grievance for me is a slightly loaded term in terms of the grievance is easy to dismiss, right? Kind of because it sounds like complaining, right? Kind of just griping, like a group of countries just coming together to gripe. But I think one could just as equally kind of like characterize it as opposition, right? So it's a group of like rich countries, all emerging like large kind of keystone economies in their particular regions, setting up an entire set of institutions, including an entire bank, in order to position themselves as in opposition to the architectures of governance that are built around Western power. Having achieved that in 10 years, actually, I think is somewhat notable, even if they'd never had any kind of like list of deliverables that they're covering. The symbolism of now there's a whole bunch of like networks and bodies and platforms and institutions and so on, all built around the concept that we don't like how the West is running things, is notable, I think, particularly if it then also includes Saudi Arabia and the UAE now.
But grievance today is the coin of the realm of politics. So I don't disagree with the characterization that it's just complaining and kvetching. I mean, grievance drives national politics in many countries around the world, not just, by the way, in the US and Europe. This is a phenomena that in polarized politics of animosity and anger is driving. I think we can talk about the BJP in India. We can talk about a lot of movements. Milei came to power on this anger as well in Argentina. So that grievance, I think there's meat in it. There's marrow in it. It's powerful. It's not just complaining.
In addition, what is particularly notable about the BRICS is that this is supranational. Right, kind of because grievance politics have emerged everywhere, as you say, but a lot of it is in the context of national fights, right? Kind of this being not only multilateral, but being like all over the world. Kind of not. It's not a group of Asian countries, for example. Kind of positioning themselves around grievance. This is grievance, shared kind of like discussion of these kind of grievances, but on several continents at once. All of these disparate kind of economy, like disparate, political systems, several of them also, as you say, facing a bunch of grievance politics within their own countries, now coming together to make this kind of like transnational, like grievance-based, kind of multilateral situation. That, I think, again, is notable. You know, if one takes into account that so much of Western power is made up of a kind of a loose but still quite formidable alliance, this is an alternative process of a different kind but similar kind of alliance building. The West and the anti-West, you know, both spread around the world, both in both the northern and southern hemispheres, both, you know, kind of like containing the largest economies, most notable economies in the world. You know, it's a notable kind of like trend to see, but it's obviously it's also a slow trend. So it's a kind of a tectonic plate movement, you know, kind of that is slowly revealing an emerging landscape rather than, you know, kind of they came together, they had a list of deliverables and they delivered, which, you know, kind of that wasn't the situation with them.
Well, there is ample evidence now, based on the remarks of former President Donald Trump, that those alliances that you talk about in the so-called West, which is presumably the U.S. and Europe, are not as strong as many people think they are. And there's a lot of good reason to believe that if he comes back to power, that those alliances fracture forever. That once Humpty Dumpty's broken, he can't be put back together again. We've talked about how the global South is difficult to define, but I think the West is also difficult to define. We should have a whole separate conversation on that, because what we're seeing in the United States and what we're seeing in Europe are very different things. So I think that's just a little tangent there in terms of what you said about those alliances in the West. Let's leave the conversation there. What a fascinating, intense conversation that we had today. This was great. I love it when we do this kind of thing. This is what we're doing every day over on the China Global South Project. You can also check out our YouTube channel. The team is making some fantastic videos on everything from China-Africa debt to the new president in Indonesia. We just did a video from our contributor in Bangkok about Chinese panda diplomacy. We do the roundtable almost every week, where the editors get together from different parts of the world to talk about these issues that we talked about today. And what you hear is all of these Global South points of view that Cobus rightly mentioned many times over the years is missing from the discourse. And there is not enough awareness of these perspectives coming from Global South countries. And what we're doing over on YouTube and on our website and also in our daily newsletter is exactly that. And if you would like to follow everything that what we're doing and also to support the work, we would be so grateful if you could subscribe at ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions are $19 a month or $199 a year. If you are a student or a teacher, email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com. I will email you back right away with a nice little note, the links for a 50% discount for those subscriptions. So let's leave the conversation there. Cobus, thank you for a very, very enlightened, vigorous discussion. This one, again, I'm all fired up today. And we'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. For Cobus Van Staden in Johannesburg, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGSProject and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.